I'd like to now welcome Dr. Ron Martinez.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Angela, for the invitation, and for everyone at BALEAP, including Conrad, who had to leave to the dentist. It's good to see him as well, and see a lot of people here who I haven't seen in a while. I want to thank the previous speakers as well, Francesc, Pedro, and also Gonzalo and Loreto for their talks, because they covered a whole lot of ground that I will not repeat too much, just allude to, and I'll try to add something to the vast territory they've covered, specifically thinking about the context of Brazil. What I have to add relates to some of the points that Francesc made about the role of English and the sort of drivers of motivation for both students and professors in EMI context. And I want to problematize if there is maybe a dissonance between those motivations, one that was alluded to by Loreto and Gonzalo. I also liked one thing that Gonzalo mentioned at the end of their presentation about exploring what they call the phenomenon from within, which I understood as wanting to understand more about local contexts and practices in local contexts. And something that has been touched on by all three speakers so far, which is sort of the relationship between proficiency and success of EMI programs. And I'll put success in air quotes as kind of highlighting that as maybe also requiring some problematization. I'm going to try to do that now. Something that Hans Malmström actually mentioned in the chat, and I should mention that Hans and I, Anne-Marie and Diane Pecorari and I are involved in research, kind of looking at that sphere right now. So I'd like to start with sort of my perspective as well, from not only as someone who's been involved in EMI in Brazil and sort of boots on the ground, local contexts with lectures in Brazilian context, but also from the perspective of an applied linguist. I'm currently a co-editor-in-chief for the journal Applied Linguistics, and we do receive a number of articles, manuscripts related to EMI, increasingly so. We were all asked as speakers to kind of look at what sort of gaps there may be in EMI right now. And what I would say is that everyone seems to be looking at the same gaps, unfortunately. And so that kind of, from the perspective of an editor, I see that's a challenge. I think part of the challenge in identifying gaps in applied linguistics is that everybody keeps looking in the same places. And because what might be interesting for applied linguists may not be interesting for higher education administrators and vice versa. And maybe we are not looking at some places that we could be looking at more. So I'm going to talk about that a bit now. I would say that with EMI in Brazil, and I would say that what the other speakers, especially Loreto and Gonzalo, mentioned earlier is consistent with mine, is that often the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing in EMI context. The right hand in this case meaning the EMI practitioners, those involved, especially the professors themselves in EMI context, those being the right hand, aren't really in contact with the left hand being sort of higher education administrators. And the left hand is not really interested often, I would say, in what the right hand has to say. I think this causes a lot of different problems, and there is some dialogue that needs to be built there, and I'm going to address what I think could be some of that dialogue. What the right hand and the left hand does seem to have in common in the Brazilian context is that their interests are often rooted in sort of mobility. So the left hand, that is the university administrators, their interests in EMI often seems to be driven by things like, increasing different aspects of internationalization so that They remain competitive to draw international talent. And also, and I would say even chiefly so in the case of Brazil, because otherwise their international mobility from lecturer mobility and student mobility won't really take place, because a lot of the international relations officers from Brazil, they're tasked with, in part, establishing and maintaining agreements, often bilateral agreements, like memoranda of understanding, in which there is an understanding that students from a Brazilian university can go to, say, a university in Europe and vice versa. But there's obviously a problem if the students from the European university are reluctant to do so, in part because the students won't be able to speak Portuguese. This is what was the case in what first started my interest in EMI, with a professor at the university where I'm currently an assistant professor of English here in Curitiba, Brazil, the Universidade Federal do Paraná, the Federal University of Paraná, where there was an agreement between a German university and this university, with that kind of bilateral exchange in place. But the UFPR, my university's part, couldn't be honored because there weren't any classes in English. And it was through that conversation that I began to realize that there was a kind of pent-up demand for lecturers in the UFPR context to be able to offer classes through English. So I set up a course, and actually one of the people who was on that course is here today, Tom Spain and Julie Dearden. We offered a course back in, I think it was the middle of 2016, and there was a shocking amount of lecturers who signed up for the course. We only had space, I think, for 20, but I think we had 200 people who were interested in it. And that got me thinking about what motivated such a great interest in that course. And some of that was alluded to by Gonzalo and Loreto in their talk, how many professors reported that they wanted to do something different. They wanted to continue to develop. They wanted to internationalize their classrooms. Many of those professors also reported that they themselves have had the chance, an opportunity for mobility at some point in their careers. And they wanted to bring that sense of internationalization to the classroom, to a context that may otherwise, and to students who otherwise may not ever have a chance to travel and to have that kind of internationalized experience. So this is one area where I think EMI in Brazil is different from, say, EMI in Spain or in parts of Western Europe, where there is sort of this, because of geographic qualities of Europe and the condensed nature of so many countries in close proximity, there is not just this sort of sense of isolation from other countries. Whereas if you're on the east coast of a Brazilian capital city, you may never travel anywhere else in Latin America, much less places where English or other languages circulate commonly. So a lot of these professors, the EMI professors, wanted to bring that experience to the students, and there are other reasons that kind of beyond the scope of this talk today I could talk about. But that's where I think there is a commonality between the interests of university administrators in Brazil and the lecturers in Brazil, which is there is some roots in mobility where the administrators, they want to be able to honor and establish further bilateral exchange agreements and offer classes through English. It's one important aspect. Mobility from the EMI professor's perspective is them having had that experience and wanting to kind of bring that kind of experience to the local context. That's where maybe the commonality ends, however, because this lack of the right hand knowing what the left hand is doing, or the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, I think is a barrier to further understanding EMI in Brazil and the research gaps that there are. And I'm reminded of a TED talk that I cite often because I loved it, given by Ernesto Ciroli, working for the UN, who recounts how he went on a mission to Africa to teach locals agricultural practices and planted, according to Ernesto Ciroli, tomatoes that were gigantic, and they were very proud of it until the next day they all seemed to have disappeared, and they discovered that there were hippopotamuses who had eaten all the tomatoes. And then they asked the locals, why didn't you tell us that these hippopotamuses were going to eat all our crops? And the locals said, well, you didn't ask. This was a talk called, if you want to really help someone, shut up and listen. And I think that a lot of the EMI administrators in Brazil could do well to listen more to what is happening actually with the EMI professors who have brought this, who are largely responsible for the actual EMI practices that are occurring in the Brazilian context. And I think this is the case because I believe in this, because in part, this is also what drove me to offer a seminar in 2019 called the Brazilian EMI Seminar, BEMIS, in which I invited not people only from applied linguistics and related circles, but also the professors themselves who I knew from various trainings that I had done in Brazil, who were waiting for someone to talk to about their practices and how excited and how proud they were of what they were doing in the classroom. And so this seminar was actually to help showcase their practices in the classroom. And it really was just really moving and compelling what they were trying to talk about, which I found that in many cases were not strands of research that the applied linguistics world was yet talking about. Just to cite a brief example, there was a professor who does English Fridays with her undergraduate students, and she does virology and pediatric research, and she didn't feel the need to want to convert her entire course content through English, but on Fridays she knew that if she allowed students some time to prepare to deliver some presentations and discussion and scaffolded that for Friday English, it was something that motivated them and enriched the content of the course and internationalized the content. And these is actual practice that at that time especially had not been looked at a lot, but which was shown to have successful results. And if success is meant by students staying in the course, staying motivated, and having internationalized experience. So this is where I feel there's an issue with the left hand thinking that they can tell the right hand what to do. Like, oh, we need to, this is what you should be doing. These are the policies. This is the minimum level of proficiency, without giving the right hand, the EMI hand, a chance to show what they already do successfully. Sort of a priori assumptions about what success is and how to get there without actually seeing what's happening already. Because I think that such a priori establishment of policy can unintentionally reinforce the feeling from these lecturers that I can't do it and my practices are not valid. So I would be much in favor of more research into what are these researchers doing more in their actual classrooms and sort of studying that without necessarily the policy having implemented that practice. And in many cases, they are unfortunately clandestine practices either because there's a lack of policy or because the policy is not clear, or they're afraid because what they're doing may violate that policy, as was the case with that lecturer in the med school one who had sort of English Fridays. And there are great professors like that person who I think are driving a lot of successful practices, and a lot of professors who have a great deal of motivation. And yet these practices, because they are not registered officially as being successful or contributing to the goals, if there are any, of internationalization of the institution, then these, at the same time as that might bring these professors to conduct these very admirable practices, EMI practices in the classroom. At the same time, I've also seen those same professors eventually give up because of the lack of validation and recognition from the institution of their local practices. To close, I would like to see more research in two areas. One being that of sort of practices, and one being that of policy. With the practices, I would love to see more research on local practices. What are these EMI professors doing, sort of, and how do they measure success, and how and why do they stay in it? At the same time, research into the policy sphere is to what extent are the policymakers conversing or dialoguing with the lecturers in their EMI context, or and to what extent are they just simply saying this is what you must do and this is the minimum level of proficiency? Because until that happens, until there's a better bi-directional dialogue, I fear that we are going to always go back to not really knowing. One of the issues that Loreto brought up is, what is the extent really of EMI happening in Latin America? How many universities are offering EMI? What sort of EMI are they offering? Because the policy that universities, if there is any, may want to establish may not be in line with what lecturers are actually doing in the classroom. And so my hope is, now that I'm conducting this research with right now with regard to proficiency and EMI, is that we keep that in the backdrop, is that even though we are exploring this sphere of, what is the effect of proficiency and what impact might it have on outcomes in EMI, to always be mindful of maybe what we see as sort of important to sort of the applied linguistics world or to the testing world may not be the same thing that matters in real life contexts, in which these professors and these students about what's happening in their own EMI and diverse EMI contexts. And so that would be my 2 cents to add to the already great comments made by the other lecturers here, and rather the other presenters here in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for building on the conversation that was started and raising the key points that you have about research needs and gaps. And we'll come back to discuss those more in the Q&A.